Hi, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of Let's Talk About It, or should I say, welcome to the very first solo episode of Let's Talk About It. While I absolutely love having guests on the show, I thought it was time to try something new. The particular topic that we're talking about today is something that has really been a focus of mine for the last now 5 years and has shaped my entire college experience as well as my future career. And that is Title IX, an educational amendment that is part of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits sexual discrimination in schools that receive federal funding, and specifically has had a huge impact on athletics. When I started the show, I really wanted to make sure that I was creating a space that educated and supported student athletes. I didn't want to just be funny. I wanted to make sure that I was giving you guys the information that I've learned and that I work on so that you are able to make the best decisions for you, whether that's during your time as a college athlete or way later on in life. So let's just get started. Like I said, Title IX is an educational amendment that was passed in 1972 as part of the Civil Rights Act. It basically just says that no one in the United States shall ever be discriminated on or denied the rights and privileges of participating in something based off sex in an educational institution. And it specifically says that receives federal funding. And I think this is one of the biggest things that people don't understand about Title IX. They think it's just public schools because it's federal funding or federal assistance. But when you actually break it down and realize what that actually means, it means that if your school receives federal funding in any area, then it's now all automatically responsible for Title IX. So for colleges and universities, for example, if anyone at school receives a Pell Grant or some kind of government grant to help with their tuition, that's federal assistance. The school is now responsible for Title IX, even if they're a private school. Or for high schools, for example, if the science department gets a donation from the federal government for beakers or supplies or art supplies or whatever, the school receives federal funding and it's now responsible for Title IX. So there's very, very few schools in the United States who are not responsible for Title IX. As a result of the Title IX legislation, participation for girls and women in sports has skyrocketed. I mean, I don't think anyone would ever venture out to say that Title IX has failed women overall, but there are a lot of things that it could be doing better. And specifically, there's a lot of things around enforcement that could be a lot better. So now that you guys understand what Title IX is, let's talk about what it does and how it's carried out. I kind of look at it as like being a kid and having rules at home. Your parents make a rule, but you never really actually follow it unless you know exactly what the rule is, who enforces the rule, and what's going to happen if you get into trouble. So first is the Department of Education. Because Title IX is specific to schools, the Department of Education is in charge of it. And then within the Department of Education, you have what's called the Office of Civil Rights. And they handle all the civil rights issues in schools across the country, K through 12, and even into college. So when I was working in Title IX advocacy and working with students and even talking to people that worked at the Office of Civil Rights, what we learned was that if you filed a complaint that you didn't think that your school was compliant with Title IX, it could take up to 2 years for the Office of Civil Rights to see it. So next you have schools and Title IX coordinators. All schools are required to have a Title IX coordinator, but the training and what's expected of that coordinator isn't really uniform. So at a lot of high schools, you might have a Title IX coordinator who also happens to be the history teacher or the football coach or the women's basketball coach. And a lot of times they don't really know exactly what Title IX is because they don't go through a specific training. What you guys are essentially getting right now is a Title IX training. And at the end of this, you might just know more about Title IX and all of its implications than the person who was in charge of it at your high school. Yeah, I know. It's crazy. Next, we have the EADA, which is the Equity and Disclosure Act, which asked schools to report their athletic data to an online website. You can go on it right now and you can find information about your university. For example, I could look up Syracuse University right now, but there's no one enforcing that data and there's no one checking it. So technically schools could misreport the data or they could take a long time to report it. For example, one year I was trying to file a Title IX compliance form for school to check for them, and their data hadn't been up, even though it was supposed to be up in October. And I kind of had to keep pushing the form down and down and down until like January or February when it was finally released. And then next is the courts. So the courts often set a precedent, which I'll talk about in future episode, and something that I really hope that we can talk more about on Let's Talk About It. But when students at schools, men or women, sometimes Title IX applies to men's sports as well, and oftentimes it does. For example, men's volleyball, in which there's not a lot of opportunities. Title IX affects a lot of that. You do have the opportunity to sue your school. And I know that's crazy. I don't think most athletes are going up to college and thinking, oh, I'm going to end up suing my school. I personally haven't considered it. But you do have the opportunity to sue your school, and that's when the courts can get involved. And there's been tons of litigation about it. Are you guys ready to talk about compliance now? So when we look at Title IX compliance specific to athletics, what you're actually doing is taking a look at what the Office of Civil Rights has said is the actualization of Title IX based off the law that I've showed you guys before. And so what they say is, okay, this is the law. How do I make it apply to athletics based off everything that happens in an athletic department in high school and college? And how do I make it something that people can follow and truly understand? And that's what schools should then take to organize their athletic departments. But then it's also how the Office of Civil Rights or lawyers look at a school's Title IX compliance to decide if they're following the law or not. So while the actual pillars of compliance are not written out in law, it is the law, because that is how the law is judged. I hope that makes sense for you guys. If not, leave questions in the comments. I'd love to answer them and to help with all of that. So there's 3 main pillars of compliance, and they have slightly different names based off who you talk to, but they all have the same 3 basic things, and that's participation, athletic scholarship, sometimes called financial assistance, and then equitable treatment. So you have those 3 pillars, and there's then a 3-prong test of those pillars to decide if a school is compliant or not. And a school needs to be compliant or hitting all 3 of those pillars to be compliant with Title IX. So let's break that down. The first one, participation. And so that's fairly simple. It's saying that the opportunities for men and women athletes should be proportional to the overall enrollment of the student body. So let's say an athletic department has 100 student athletes. So there's a percentage of that 100 that's men athletes and a percentage of that 100 that's women athletes, right? So between all of the men's sports, you have like 50 athletes, and between all the women's sports, you have 50. That would be equality, exact same number. But as we know, there's lots of different sports. Some schools don't have men's soccer, they just have women's soccer, or football is a huge one that can kind of mess around with the numbers. So what you actually look at is proportionality to student overall enrollment. So let's go with Cornell. So if 75% of the students who go to Cornell, period, are women, then the proportionality part would say that 75% of student athletes should be women. So that would mean potentially that you have more women's teams than you have men's teams. It's not straight equality, it's the proportionality of it. This is exactly where men's sports can often get wrapped up into Title IX, even though it's a gender equity issue and you assume that that's typically just around women. Men's volleyball, like I said before, is a huge example of this. You have lots of people who want to start men's volleyball teams at schools across the country who can't, because adding that men's team would mess up the proportionality of men to women. And similarly, when schools are trying to do budget cuts, like many of them did during COVID, you might see more teams than necessary be cut. So a school might say, we have $5 million that we need to save this year, and women's rowing costs us $5 million a year, so we're cutting that. They can't just end there. They might also cut the men's track team because they're considering the participation prong of Title IX. It's not perfect. Anytime, people have to be cut or things like that have to happen, that's not great, but that is the way that the Office of Civil Rights has set out that first prong of participation. Next, we have athletic scholarships and financial assistance. So this is specific to financial aid. And this is where with NIL and revenue sharing, things start to get sticky. We're not going to talk about that today because we're going to do just a traditional Title IX training. And there's so much changing with all of that I could post it and it would change tomorrow. So we will save those conversations for when I have some more experts and people in the industry to kind of chop it up with me and talk about all of that. At its root, athletic scholarships and financial assistance is the exact same idea as the participation pillar. Now, though, it's saying it's based off proportionality of the athletic department. If 75% of your athletes are women, then 75% of scholarships and financial assistance should go to women. So that includes actual financial scholarships, like Alston money award payments, like all those kinds of things. The last one, equitable treatment, is the most confusing and honestly the one where most schools end up being out of compliance. This one can feel hard for a lot of people to understand. In my opinion, that's because we're so used to seeing men's sports or boys teams get so much more than others. So equitable treatment includes basically everything outside of your actual roster spot and the money that you get from the school. So jerseys, uniforms, equipment, the scheduling of your games and practices, your travel and per diem, where you stay in hotels, your coaches and coaches assignments, how many coaches you have, your coach's salary, medical training, insurance coverage, the supplies that you have in the training room, how trainers are assigned to teams, your housing, dining facilities services, your publicity and promotional support, which is super important for NIL now, recruitment of student athletes, basically anything that's not your athletic scholarship or Alston money and your actual roster spot is held under equitable treatment. And what I've actually done over the last couple of years is actually help athletic departments figure out how to organize all of this in equitable treatment and create a plan to, one, check how they're doing, and two, how to slowly improve it. So again, this is about proportionality overall. So it's not men's basketball flies private, so women's basketball has to fly private. So what you actually do is look at, out of all the men's sports, what are all the things that the men's sports get? And what do all the things the women's sports get? And if I ranked them all together on a matrix, and I compared the final score for men and the final score for women, would it be proportional or would it be equitable overall? That's how you decide the equitable treatment pillar. Very, very complicated, but just something to know and understand. And it's something I want to highlight, especially for revenue generating sports, is that does not matter. And also for kind of like boosters and different things. Like it gets sticky because of how donations work to schools, but in the end, it's the same. The overall spending and resources given to men's sports should in the end be equal for women's sports and vice versa. I think a great example of looking at this, if we could look at it in a vacuum, is the March Madness tournament from a couple of years ago, where you saw the photos of the men's weight room and they had the benches and the plates and all of these different things. And then the women's weight room basically looked like a hotel. Like they had like up to 10-pound weights and like some yoga mats, right? And imagine the women's March Madness and men's March Madness was an athletic department. That would be a Title IX violation. People weren't just saying like, oh, women's sports just have yoga mats and the guys have benches and that's not fair. But when you look at the overall experience of women's March Madness versus men's March Madness, that would be like a Title IX violation. When you calculate the benefits of everything that the men and women get, it's unequal. It's not fair. Unfortunately, though, the NCAA is not responsible for Title IX, so that wasn't actually considered a Title IX violation. But I think that's a great example to kind of understand like how it looks in a big organization. Okay, I made this episode as a resource for all of you. So I'm going to finish this episode with a call to action, and that is to send this episode to a friend who you think could benefit from the information. And I would say that one of the biggest things that I've learned throughout my last few years in college is just that knowledge is never wasted and you can't advocate for yourself unless you know what's going on. So I hope that you felt this episode was informative. I hope you got something out of it. If you have questions, leave them down in the comments or DM me at LTBI Pod, and I'll see you guys next week.